This video shows you how to replace your belts and your water pump for your Pontiac G3 or the Aveo5. So first release the hood latch and bring it up and put the hood prop on. From that point on is we're going to need as much clearance as we can possibly get. We'll first remove the sensor for the intake. This is for the mass airflow sensor. It's helpful if you have a pick, just pull it towards you, pinch it up, and out it goes. And from this point on, you're going to need about a quarter size socket or a wrench to be able to loosen those air clamps. And once you get them removed, get them out of the way. And I didn't show the video clip to turn the Phillips screw, but you should be able to figure that out on your own. And we'll remove the rest of the air filter housing. This is a 10mm socket. There's 4 of them. 2 is by the shock tower and the other 2 is closer to the headlight. Whenever you are removing bolts or nuts, it's always going to be good practice to put it back exactly where you found it. Or you can get some Ziploc bags and you can label them, but that's going to be a little bit more work. And in this case, we're just going to put everything back. And from this point on, what we're going to do is to loosen up the power steering bolts. There's 2 of them. These 2 are a little bit more difficult to remove. It is a 12mm and they are under tension, and to be able to put them back, it's also going to be the biggest pain out of this whole process. You can just do this somewhere in the middle, get the sensor removed so that way you don't screw it up. In my case, it's already been banged up before I got to it, but it's just better to take it off anyways. So let's move on. Next part is on the top power steering hose. We'll remove the mounting bracket. And it's a 10mm bolt, just put it back on. And next thing, after we get this last bolt removed, we're gonna take off the belt. Now this typically is a one-time use belt, so if you do happen to remove it, typically you'd want to replace it. And in my case, it was still brand new, and so I just put it back exactly where it was. Next thing is if you have some offset pliers, this is to remove the lower hose of the power steering pump. And clip that on, get it removed. It's helpful if you have a pick to be able to separate the hose from the assembly. It's really not going to be in your best interest to just try to yank it off by force, because if your hoses are as old as these things are, there's a high likelihood that you'll break them. So be smart, get yourself like a $5-10 pick set, and it will save you a lot of grief. And after we put this out of the way, use something to be able to plug both the power steering pump opening and for the lower power steering pump hose. Next thing is to chock the wheels, pull the park brake, and we're gonna jack up the vehicle on the front passenger side. Once we get that removed, we're gonna take off the tire. Obviously, if you don't have any impact wrenches, you're gonna wanna loosen the lug nuts before doing this process. And in this case, this is going to be a 19mm socket, and we'll take these off. I have a Milwaukee 1/2-inch impact wrench, and once we get them removed, again, put the lug nuts back to where the studs are. I do place my tire underneath where the whole assembly is, so that way, in case my jack fails for whatever reason, it's going to get caught on by the rim. Next up is going to be placing a support underneath the oil pan using a block of wood. So get something that's going to be wide enough to evenly distribute the weight, so that way your floor jack is not going to punch a hole through that piece. And I believe, if I recall correctly, that's a 17mm socket that we're going to take off for the engine mount on the passenger side. We'll get 3 of them that are loosened up that goes towards the engine, and the 3 that goes towards the body. And we're gonna put the bolts back exactly where we found them. And this will be a really good time to inspect your engine mount before removing all of this, so that way you'll have your replacements beforehand, because it'll be easier if you get this all done at one time than trying to go back and doing it again. And once we have that removed, it's going to be supported by the floor jack that we placed underneath that's keeping it up. This case, this gives us the clearance that we need to be able to move the belt side up and down to access the bolts that goes to the water pump. The next part, I am not, again, 100% sure if it's necessary or not, but we're going to take off the headlight. And it only has about 3 10mm bolts, and as you can tell, I've done a little bit of work on there, so that way I only had 2 bolts, but the one that goes between the grill and the headlight, there's one right down there, but I didn't put it back, so just keep that in mind. Next thing is we're going to remove the 3 connectors. I didn't get a chance to show you the removal for the headlight plug, but just pull it straight out, and the other ones are just pinch connectors to be able to get them off. Once you get that out of the way, this is going to be a 45mm, or no, a 45 Torx. That's going to be on a 1/4 inch offset combination wrench, and that's what I use to be able to access this off to the side. So use your best judgment. You may or may not have to remove the engine mount or the headlight, but just for the sake of, I guess, the video and to make it easier on me, I did remove all 3 of them. Keep the belt on for the rest of the engine. That will keep it in place, so that way you don't have to use something to be able to remove the water pump pulley. And after we get that removed, next up is this 3/4 12-point combination wrench. That's the only thing that will really fit. You can try to use a 6-point, but when I used this before, it did end up stripping it. So the best thing is going to be a 3/4 12-point wrench. Once we get that removed, what we're going to take off are the rest of the pulley and the belt as well. Now this, what holds the water pump, is a special socket called the E10, and that's the size of it. There's about 5 of them. So once you get that removed, place something underneath the vehicle so that way you can catch as much coolant as you can. It's always good practice to clean up the mating surfaces as best as you can, especially for any old gaskets that happen to be stuck either on the engine block, and double check to make sure that every single piece that you have on that water pump is good exactly, and that O-ring is going to be seated exactly where it needs to be, and make sure you don't pinch it or you're going to do the whole thing over. It is good practice to use Loctite, the blue thread locker, on every single piece that we're going to put back, because anything that vibrates tends to loosen over time, aka whenever your vehicle is running. What we're doing now is just getting everything about snug, and always turn things by hand at least twice, 2 full revolutions before tightening it completely with a wrench. And I am not sure if this thing has a torque sequence. I just did things in a crisscross pattern. And for the 45 Torx bolts, we just put the pulley back in place and put the 3 bolts and hand tighten them at first. And you should be able to just hold the pulley by hand while you're tightening the 3 bolts to be able to put it back in place. You can only probably do this about hand tight after putting the belt, and then you can just tighten it up all the way. In my case, I was able to just hold the pulley and be able to tighten this as best as I can. So even if you don't get things to be super tight, the Loctite will keep it in place. The rest of this is pretty much just the exact opposite of what we did from before. So I'm not going to have the whole thing, but I'll get as much as I can. We just put the belt back in place, and a good practice is to make sure all the grooves fit where the ridges are on the belt. After that, on the top powering steering hose, we just put the 10mm bolt back on, plug the sensor back in, and we'll put the power steering to the water pump. Again, use your best judgment. If you get a new one, it's going to be extremely tight, and in this case, mine was still as well. So I put Loctite on the 2 bolts on here. We just put the bolts back on the engine mount, again, it's going to be super helpful if you just put them exactly where you found them, so that way you're not crossing bolts, you're not missing anything, and you're not going to be one of those mechanics that tends to have a bunch of extra bolts after the fact. So we just put the floor jack, pump it back up, and get it leveled. I did use the impact back on, but they were hand tightened at first for at least 2 full revolutions before using the torque wrench to finalize everything. Once you're confident that the engine mount is back in place, you can release the floor jack to be able to lower it to its natural resting state. And I'm smacking the 2 bolts on here just because they will not come on there pretty easy, or at least not slide in without some great effort. At least in my case anyway. You might have a different luck, but it took me a little bit just to put those 2 stupid things back on. The rest of it is just a reversal of how you did things. If you found it helpful, give it a thumbs up. I appreciate it. Take care, bud.